Hey, Mrs. Paul here. We are moving on to our next unit, all about genetics. And so in order to understand how genetics occur, we need to understand the ways that genetic variability can occur. By genetic variability, we're talking about genetics, and genetics is the science of heredity. And something that is heritable is something that's passed on from one generation to the next. So if you look at your own family, you may have traits from your mom or from your dad or even from your grandparents, because each generation continues to pass on similar DNA and similar genes. By variability, to be variable means to have different things, and so genetic variability means that all organisms are different because they could have different alleles. And we'll talk about what we mean by alleles. But pretty much we're talking about different genes. And so these genes can be different because of three different options. The first is crossing over, the second is different genes and alleles, and the third is mutations. And so we're going to talk about each of these individually. And so this video is going to focus on just crossing over. So to give you some examples of genetic variability, here's a man who has 6 fingers. So if you look closely at this picture and count those, he actually has 6 fingers. And 6 fingers is actually a dominant trait. And so he had to have gotten that trait from one of his parents who also had 6 fingers. Here's a lovely family, and it kind of throws you off a little bit because this family all has dark skin except this newest little baby. This is actually a biological family, and this baby did come from these parents because of a recessive trait. And so even though all of them have dark skin, they still were able to carry in their DNA the gene for lighter colored skin. And this baby happened to get the lighter colored skin. The last example here is somebody with a genetic disorder called heterochromia. Hetero meaning different. And so they have 2 different eye colors in the same eye. And so we'll talk about how mutations can lead to some genetic disorders such as this one. So before we move on to our first type of genetic variability, which is crossing over, we're going to back up a second and refresh our memories about meiosis. So here's our meiosis chart that we created, and we learned that meiosis is the splitting of cells to create 4 genetically different gametes that only have half of the DNA. When cells have half the DNA, it's called haploid. And so these haploid gametes in the end are all different. But we never explained how they get to be different. We just explained that they're different and have variability because that makes all organisms different, which means that if all humans are different, we're not all going to die from the same thing, and our species is going to continue to survive. And so here meiosis has occurred in one cell from either your mom or your dad. And so your mom has created 4 gametes that are all eggs, or this could have happened in your dad, and your dad created 4 sperm that are all different as well. So let's take a look at how they can be different. This difference, called crossing over, is going to be happening during the first phase of mitosis during meiosis. So remember that during meiosis, the process of mitosis, where it goes through prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, actually happens twice. So it happens here to split it into 2 cells, and then it happens here again to both of those 2 cells to split each of those 2 cells into 2 new cells to end with 4 gametes. So again, during meiosis, there's this process called crossing over. So here's our cell, here's our lovely cell membrane, and this is a normal cell, either from your mom or your dad, and this is before meiosis even happens. So remember that Before meiosis or mitosis happens, a cell has to go through the cell cycle to prepare for meiosis or mitosis. And so it can prepare by growing larger, making more DNA, and then making more organelles and preparing to go into mitosis. And so this is a normal cell before meiosis even starts happening. And so in our cell we have chromosomes. And so remember, this is a cell from either our mom or our dad. The colors here don't matter. The colors are only going to help us understand crossing over a little bit better. So notice that that picture, that image, went up to this little corner up here because that's going to be the area that shows our finished chart. And that's what we're going to record in our notebook at the end of the video. So here's our next picture that we'll see. So here's our cell again, and now we have two sets of chromosomes because interphase has happened. Remember that during interphase, DNA doubles. So we took that one set of chromosomes and we've doubled it into two sets. So the next step is where meiosis actually starts happening. And so this is our first step of mitosis. And so remember that the first step of mitosis is prophase. And so during prophase, all the DNA is in that squiggly line and it gets condensed into chromosomes. As it does that, it's then going to start moving into metaphase where the chromosomes are going to start lining up. As the chromosomes are moving all around, they actually touch each other and cross over each other. And so during prophase 1, crossing over happens. So the chromosomes literally cross over each other and they touch. And they touch at the same region where they have the same gene, maybe for eye color, and they actually switch genes. And so here's one chromosome that has a gene maybe for brown eye color. And here's another chromosome that has a gene for blue eye color. Those are called alleles. And we're going to learn more about alleles in our next chart. And so here again, they literally touch and they exchange those genes. And that's called crossing over. So they've crossed over, they've touched, they've exchanged genes. Mitosis is going to continue. So here mitosis has finished and it has created two new cells. And we can see that those cells have chromosomes, but they're not exactly the same anymore. And so then mitosis is going to happen again. Each of those two cells is going to split into two new cells, and we get a total of 4 cells called gametes that are all different. And if you take a look, we can see that they're all different now because of those different colors I used. So we have this cell that has a red chromosome, and this cell that has half red and half blue, and this cell has half blue and half red, and this cell that has a full blue chromosome. So what happened is that those 4 gametes were created, but they're different versions because they have the same gene on each chromosome, but the gene is slightly different. It could be saying have brown eyes or have blue eyes. And so even though the gene is still saying eye color, it's saying a different eye color. And so that difference is called an allele. So this happens because of a law created by this man named Mendel. And we're going to learn more about him next week when we learn about how traits can be passed on from one generation to the next. And so we'll learn more about him. But one of his laws is called the law of segregation. To segregate means to separate. And so as we see down here in the bottom, our chromosomes have been segregated and separated into separate gametes. And so all this law is saying is that there were alleles, so an allele for brown eye color and an allele for blue eye color, and they got separated so that each gamete down here either has an allele for blue or has an allele for brown. And so that those alleles got separated to make haploid gametes that can now be used for fertilization. And so remember, these are either all egg or all sperm. And these can now be used to combine with an egg or a sperm to create a zygote. So fertilization can occur. And so this, again, is the first form of genetic variability. And remember, we already learned about the process of meiosis. All we're doing is adding to it to explain that during meiosis, this process of crossing over can occur, where the chromosomes literally cross over each other, touch, and exchange segments called genes. So that in the end, we still get our gametes, but they're genetically different. So in our next video, we'll move on and explain more about genes and alleles.